And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today for this portal into the past, where I document the 60s in real time with podcasts like this, with our evening news reports, with audio clips and commercials of the day, as well as our daily timeline. And that timeline, along with each and every podcast, links to social media, including our ever-expanding Facebook page, over 15,000 followers strong, it's all there for you on our website, realtime1960s.com. And today, on this first installment of a three-part episode, I thought before we head into our coverage of 1963, I would take a look back at 62 and give you my personal top 10 list of films released that year. So I've given very careful consideration to this question and ranked all 10, which I'll cover in reverse order. So today, we'll do numbers 10 through 7. So without further ado, the Best of 62 at the Movies Part 1, right now. And we begin with number 10, the first ever James Bond film, based on Ian Fleming's sixth Bond novel, Dr. No, published in 1958. Now, full disclosure, I'm not what you would call a Bond fanatic. At their best, they're just kind of fun fantasies, and I do enjoy them on that level. But they do seem to consistently deliver a little less than expected. Sort of like store-bought candy, like M&Ms. They always look so enticing when you're standing on line at the register, but if you do give in and buy them, they're only okay. But I did feel that Dr. No belonged on the tail end of this list, just because of how influential the Bond series was on the style of the 60s. But I would say of the 5 Bond films in which Sean Connery starred in the 60s, Dr. No is maybe only the 4th or 5th best. I would say the 2 that followed it, From Russia with Love and Goldfinger, are probably the best, perhaps of the entire series. But with this film, Dr. No, the producers hadn't yet totally perfected the formula. They were still kind of figuring it out, although there certainly are critical Bond elements already in place that would stay. That great jazzy theme by Monty Norman, along with the stylish opening credits, the sexual frankness in the dialogue, and much more explicit violence than I think audiences were accustomed to seeing. The pleasing visual scheme, the colors in Dr. No really pop. Much of it was shot outdoors in Jamaica. And then, as in later films, you get the typical allegedly brilliant villain. In this case, the half-Chinese scientist, Dr. No, whose murder methods are utterly ludicrous but cinematic. A bomb or a bullet apparently being too easy. Dr. No, at one point, has a henchman place an enormous tarantula in Bond's hotel bed. The stuntman, Bob Simmons, who doubles for Connery in this film, later said that having that tarantula crawl up his body was easily the most frightening stunt he ever performed. Now, as far as differences from later entries, Dr. No is certainly less lavish production-wise, no fancy gadgets, for example, and it's a bit more serious and kind of plausible, barely. In later entries, plausibility is gleefully shredded in favor of the over-the-top sequence, or in the case of Goldfinger, the memorable image. If you remember in that film, Shirley Eaton's body is discovered completely covered in gold paint, and she is described with a straight face as having died of skin suffocation, an absolutely fictional disorder. But it did give us that iconic image which made the cover of Life magazine. And while Connery's Bond in Dr. No does show some basic verbal wit, his lines in this one are not as deliberately funny as in later films, where the screenwriters lean much more heavily on wordplay and puns. In fact, I would say too heavily by the Roger Moore era. Now, the plot of this film, fairly simple by Bond standards, revolves around the mysterious Dr. No, played by Joseph Wiseman, who is a key member of Spectre, a special executive for counterintelligence, terrorism, revenge, and extortion. A scientific genius who's been disrupting Project Mercury space launches from Cape Canaveral, as it was then called, with his specially constructed radio beam. He does this basically just to be annoying. And the truth is, once Bond and the beautiful Honey Rider, played by the Swiss-German Ursula Andress, have penetrated Dr. No's island lair, the film, with a much lower budget, budget at $1.1 million than later entries does sag a bit. Because they just weren't able to fund the extravagant contraptions and sets that you see in the later films. Remember, nobody knew how successful this would be. Connery was virtually an unknown, especially here. So even though the film was released in Britain in October of '62 and did well there, it wasn't released here until May of '63, just because executives at United Artists, first of all, they didn't really like the film, and they also didn't quite know how to market it. So the initial American release that spring came with minimal publicity expenditures. They almost treated it like a B movie. Releasing it in drive-ins and so forth. Of course, it ended up making a huge amount of money, especially when it was re-released as a double feature in 1964 with From Russia with Love. But this first Bond film got some great free publicity when it was revealed that President Kennedy was a huge fan of the Ian Fleming novels and had requested a private showing of Dr. No at the White House. Actually, the reason the producers settled on From Russia with Love as the second film in the series, even though that novel had preceded Dr. No, was the fact that Kennedy had named it as one of his 10 favorite books to Life magazine. Sadly, From Russia with Love was the last film he ever saw. It was screened at the White House on November 20th, 1963, just 2 days before Dallas. Moving on to number 9 on our list, Cape Fear, a thriller of a different type. Gregory Peck, who stars as upstanding attorney Sam Bowden, also co-produced this film, and his stated goal was to, quote, make a first-class professional entertainment intelligently done, unquote. And to accomplish that task, he reunited with director J. Lee Thompson, with whom he had just made the very successful, although boring in my opinion, war-adventure film, The Guns of Navarone. Now, the primary virtues of Cape Fear are a truly menacing performance by Robert Mitchum, who didn't really want the role of Max Cady, Peck's nemesis in the film, or it wasn't so much the role he was against, he just didn't feel like working. But after Peck and Thompson had flowers and a case of bourbon delivered to Mitchum's home in Maryland, he took the part. So there you go. The film's other primary virtue is the orchestral soundtrack by frequent Alfred Hitchcock collaborator Bernard Herrmann. And while it's true that it's mostly a rehashing of techniques he had used in earlier films, especially Psycho, Herrmann does introduce a new and very effective wrinkle in Cape Fear. Mitchum plays a rapist who blames Peck for his just completed incarceration, Peck having witnessed and interrupted the sexual assault, and then having served as a witness at the trial. So Mitchum, a very nasty piece of work, but highly intelligent, migrates to Peck's hometown with the sole purpose of methodically destroying Peck and his wife and daughter. And as is typically done in films with a truly psychopathic antagonist, you're shown early on just how dangerous and how terrifying he can be, just to kind of put you on notice. In Kiss of Death, for example, that was a film noir released in 1947, where Richard Widmark plays a giggling, pot-smoking psycho named Tommy Udo. In an early scene in that film, he uses an electrical cord to bind an old woman to her wheelchair and then pushes her down a flight of stairs, laughing as he does so. It's a truly shocking moment, the memory of which sticks with you throughout the film. So here, that initial kind of introductory act of terror is the rape of a young woman that Mitchum picks up in a bar. Apparently he has not been rehabilitated. Now, it's not shown, but the prelude is, as Mitchum, with those lizard-like eyes and muscular frame, just kind of bears down on her, and his normal expression, which is kind of cynical amusement at the world, clouds over into real rage. It's scary. And in the postlude, we see how traumatized she is. So here, Herrmann on the soundtrack has the string bass players play dissonant chord clusters. It's not something you often hear because it sounds wrong. Chords played on pitches that low just sound muddy, especially on strings, but that's the point. First of all, the very wrongness of the sound underlines the wrongness of what you're seeing. And secondly, it's almost as if with that low, murky sound, you get kind of a sonic representation of masculinity just gone horribly awry. But Herrmann was a genius. But people often describe Charade a comedic thriller released the following year as the best Hitchcock movie Hitchcock never made. It was directed by Stanley Donen as a kind of homage. And I would say Cape Fear is the second best. Charade in the lighter style of, say, North by Northwest, with the same leading man, actually, Cary Grant. But this one, again, more in the vein of Psycho or Strangers on a Train. Now, Martin Scorsese directed a much more explicitly violent remake of Cape Fear, released in 1991. In my opinion, it's inferior to the original, but it does make one interesting modification. Sam Bowden, the Peck character, played in the remake by Nick Nolte, is no longer just a witness to Katie's previous assault, but had served as Katie's defense attorney at the trial. And he had been so appalled by Katie, who's played in the remake by an over-the-top Robert De Niro, that Nolte had deliberately buried evidence of both the rape victim's promiscuity as well as Katie's unawareness of her actual age. Evidence that may have lessened Katie's sentence or even gotten him off entirely. And Katie has discovered this legal malfeasance while in prison. So Scorsese gives us a little more of a rationale for Katie's revenge crusade, and also some moral gray area with the protagonist. Whereas in the original version, Peck is just a solid citizen being unfairly hounded by this kind of walking vendetta. But it did surprise me, watching this film again, just how disturbing it is. I mean, it's abundantly clear that Mitchum's ultimate goal in the film is to sexually assault Peck's teenage daughter, which caused British censors to cut about 6 minutes out of the film. Now, oddly enough, the only restriction American censors enforced was to have the word rape taken out of the picture, which is kind of an odd restriction. The word itself is not really offensive, and it had been used before in Hollywood films, notably Anatomy of a Murder, released 3 years earlier. But the reason the censors said they wanted that word removed was that in the novel upon which the film is based, called The Executioners by John D. MacDonald, the Katie character was a court-martialed soldier. So the censors said that depicting Katie as a soldier who raped reflected adversely on the U.S. military. But here's the problem with that rationale, or two problems actually. First of all, there's no mention in the film of Katie's having been a soldier. And second of all, it's made crystal clear that he is in fact a rapist, even without the word. But either way, it's a film substantially darker and more disturbing than something you would have seen in the 50s. So it does give you the sense that the game was changing a bit around this time as far as the depiction of the uglier aspects of the human condition. So Mitchum is great. Peck is fine, playing his usual solid American citizen. Not as good as his Academy Award-winning performance in To Kill a Mockingbird, released later in '62. We'll discuss that in a later episode, but that's a whole different level film. There are also some juicy supporting performances in Cape Fear by some good New York actors, including Martin Balsam, another Hitchcock connection. He played the private detective in Psycho. Here, he's the police chief. And the private detective in this film, who encourages Peck to hire some muscle to lean on Mitchum, which does not work at all, is played by Telly Savalas, still sporting hair in 1962. He didn't shave his head until '65 when he played Pontius Pilate in The Greatest Story Ever Told. After that, he just kept it that way for the rest of his life. Great actor. Now, Cape Fear does have a similar weakness to Dr. No, in that the last half hour sags. For some reason, the entrapment of Mitchum in the final act is a little too simple, or maybe it just takes too long. But it does include that famous moment where Mitchum cracks an egg and smears it on Peck's wife. Another Hitchcockian touch. He loved working food into his scenarios. But there it is, number 9 on our list, Cape Fear. Okay, number 8 is a film regarded by many as the finest ever made. It would not even crack my top 50, but an impressive spectacle, to say the least. Beautifully photographed in Super Panavision by Freddie Young, earning him the first of 3 Academy Awards, all for films directed by David Lean. This one, Dr. Zhivago, and Ryan's Daughter. This one also won Best Picture for 1962, Lawrence of Arabia. The one film on this list that, for all its visual brilliance, I struggled to get through. It's not just the bloated length at close to 4 hours. It's very slow paced, especially for a war film. It's repetitive, and finally there's a maddening scarcity of historical background for the Arab campaign of World War I and the subsequent Arab National Council, which are both partially and in many ways inaccurately depicted by the filmmakers. The character of T.E. Lawrence, the British officer, diplomat, and writer, also remains a bit incomplete for me, which may have been intentional, but it makes it difficult to know how to classify this film. You know, is it a historical epic or is it a character study? A lot of the time, to me at least, it seems like the filmmakers hadn't quite decided, and so it comes off merely as a just marvelous photographic display. But Lawrence, portrayed by Peter O'Toole, is presented in this film as a kind of misfit who lacks a central identity, other than nonconformity and a kind of maniacal determination. And those traits seem to explain the almost obsessive enthusiasm with which he volunteers to go to the desert, where he throws in his lot with the Arabs, and as a kind of guerrilla leader manages to temporarily at least unite tribal leaders who would normally be killing each other, and leads them in a successful surprise attack on the Turks at Aqaba, after which Lawrence kind of shuttles back and forth between British headquarters and further battles with the Arabs, during which he becomes increasingly disillusioned with the horrors of war, with the disunity of the Arabs, and also a kind of disturbing sadistic streak that he discovers in himself. He enjoys killing. This depiction of Lawrence's character, by the way, was disputed by family members, notably his brother Arnold, a classical scholar, as well as by a number of people who served with Lawrence. So, similar to a film we'll discuss in a later episode, Birdman of Alcatraz, you're almost better off looking at this film not so much as a faithful biopic, but as a kind of semi-fictional study of a man who struggles with this kind of lack of identity. So the two major assets of this film are clear. Number one, the photography and visual compositions, which are superb, and which greatly influenced both George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. And number two, Peter O'Toole's magnificent lead performance, the first of 8 Best Actor nominations for him, none successful. That's a record, by the way, shared with Glenn Close, the most acting nominations with no wins. But he manages to infuse this somewhat androgynous, not entirely sympathetic character with a huge amount of charisma. But again, we learn virtually nothing of Lawrence's earlier life, other than the fact that he was the illegitimate child of an absentee father, nor do we learn the ultimate impact, or lack thereof, of this Arab campaign on the outcome of World War I. Although one point is made, and that is that the British, who at this point were entering the terminal phase of their empire status, whether they knew it or not, were cynically using the Arabs for their own purposes in the region, and really had no serious intention, at least initially, of granting them autonomy in territory that the British regarded as theirs. So for a mostly British production, it's kind of an anti-British film. Now there's something else missing in Lawrence of Arabia. Women. You do see them in the desert, but not a single sentence in this 4-hour film is uttered by an actress. And again, given the length, to me at least, that presents a problem. I mean, I guess it's understandable given the subject matter, but it's another element that made it hard for me to get through this film, at least in one sitting. So, you know, if you're into sand, expertly photographed in close-up, medium, and wide shots, and if you're into camels, the desert scenes, by the way, were shot in Jordan, Morocco, and Spain. And if you enjoy sort of vaguely exotic Tchaikovsky-ish music, the score, composed by Maurice Jarre, won the Academy Award. I would not have voted that way. I would have given it to Elmer Bernstein for To Kill a Mockingbird. But if you're into those things, this is your picture. I may be in the minority on this, I probably am. But I personally don't really get the uncritical adulation. I mean, as a film of extraordinary technical accomplishments and great acting, it had to make this list. I mean, it's a hugely impressive spectacle. My criticism is not that it does what it does badly. It's what it doesn't do. Present what I assume is an important historical episode in fuller context. And with 4 hours of screen time, that should be very achievable. I had a similar problem, by the way, with a more recent film that I also thought was overpraised, Dunkirk, which gave even less historical background about that World War II evacuation than this one does about the Arab campaign of World War I. Okay, our last film for today, number 7 on my top 10 list, is as small-scaled as Lawrence is huge, both in length at just 90 minutes and in budget. It was shot in suburban Philadelphia for just $183,000. Compare that to $15 million for Lawrence. Even so, I found this modest little film called David and Lisa about young people suffering from mental illness far more absorbing, despite some rough edges, which ultimately are pretty mild and very forgivable, given the budget and lack of experience of the filmmakers. Keir Dullea, who a few years later would play the astronaut who disconnects HAL the supercomputer in 2001, is perfectly cast as David Clemens, a bright and sensitive young man, but also arrogant and very neurotic, with a kind of obsessive and extreme aversion to being physically touched. And David, in the film's opening scene, is dropped off at a private residential psychiatric institution by his somewhat clueless, overly status-conscious mother. So at the institution, David meets the head psychiatrist, Dr. Alan Swinford, played well by Howard Da Silva, who usually plays villains. And David also meets the other young patients as well, including Lisa Brandt, played by the lovely Janet Margolin, an actress I was totally unfamiliar with. Now, Lisa is described as schizoid. She has 2 personas. The Lisa persona is shy, somewhat flirtatious, and speaks only in rhyme. And the Muriel persona, which appears far less often, doesn't speak at all, but writes down or draws what she has to say. The film, with the exception of an occasional dream sequence, David has a recurring nightmare of murdering people with a clock, is shot in a very basic semi-documentary style, and it charts David's halting but definite forward progress, aided by Dr. Swinford, towards some sort of stability, and perhaps even love, as he develops his relationship with Lisa, toward whom he is uncharacteristically tender and solicitous. Now, there's a very interesting and very believable dynamic between David and Dr. Swinford, who is portrayed as neither overly lovable, as the psychiatrists in Ordinary People or Good Will Hunting are, nor overly remote, but rather as an actual human being, with no great claims on ultimate wisdom, but still enough knowledge and empathy to point David in the correct general direction. He responds to David's early hostile suspicion with professional calm and modest little insights, which David usually rejects and ridicules. But then, when interacting with his peers, David will quote and pass off as his own the doctor's insights, which he had just apparently rejected. I found that very believable. The film is based on a semi-fictional novella by an accomplished psychiatrist, Theodore Isaac Rubin, whose most famous nonfiction book, Compassion and Self-Hate, An Alternative to Despair, was published in 1975 and remains in print. But this film was a team effort. The screenplay was adapted by Dr. Rubin's wife, Eleanor Rosenfeld, who was a special education teacher at that time. So there's a definite air of authenticity to the film, despite, as I said, some rough edges. One scene in particular I thought lacked nuance. A family dinner with David and his parents. So the characterization of the mother in general lacks nuance. But any film that introduces me to a world about which I know basically nothing, and the world of the residential psychiatric facility certainly qualifies, thankfully. I consider that a great gift, although I'm sure that that world has changed dramatically in the intervening 60 years as the whole field of psychiatry has changed. Now, one criticism leveled at the film by some critics at the time is the fact that the origins of the various disorders of the young characters are not explained. And that's a criticism I find totally unjustified. I mean, it's true, the lack of explanation, but not everything in life can be easily explained, especially in matters of the mind. I mean, those 1950s Freudian psychodramas. A classic example would be The Three Faces of Eve with Joanne Woodward, where there's this magical clue, a buried childhood trauma revealed at the end that ostensibly explains why she has this multiple personality disorder. And once that trauma has been exposed, she lives more or less happily ever after. Actually, that dynamic holds in the two later films that I mentioned, Ordinary People and Good Will Hunting, although it's less ludicrous. To me, those films are a little dishonest, but I guess Hollywood feels, probably with some justification, that people like clear answers and resolution. But again, life isn't like that. So in my opinion, that criticism of David and Lisa, I would consider that praise. I think the film was quite courageous in bucking that general trend. But this issue of mental illness was definitely in the air in 1962. President Kennedy, who was greatly affected by the struggles of his sister, Rosemary, in that regard. Now, what her actual problem was remains not quite clear. She had seizures, some physical incoordination, she was a slow learner, and she had violent mood swings. She certainly shouldn't have been lobotomized, as the father did, without consulting the mother beforehand, if you can imagine that. But President Kennedy at least tried to make this problem a priority during his incomplete administration. Now, how effective those efforts were, I don't know. I would guess partially. There was a kind of idealism of the new frontier and then Johnson's Great Society. This idea that any problem could be solved if enough study commissions and money were thrown at it. I think those programs were often partially successful. But Kennedy did speak on this topic fairly often with great compassion. And that's a quality, compassion, that really enriches this film, which in August of '62 ended up stealing the show at the Venice Film Festival, where it received a standing ovation and just rave reviews from European critics. The film's neophyte director, Frank Perry, was nominated for an Academy Award, but lost out, I think correctly, to David Lean for Lawrence of Arabia. But David and Lisa released inauspiciously in New York right in the middle of a newspaper strike, so essentially no print ads to even tell people where it was playing. But it became a surprise hit basically on word of mouth and ran well into 1963, pulling in about $2.3 million, so over 12 times what it cost to make. Now, I don't want to overpraise the film. It's a modest achievement. But that compassion I mentioned, as well as the perfect casting and performances, it's a moving film with a fair amount of insight into what makes people tick. And not just the mentally ill, but people in general. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. And stay tuned for the next installment of this 3-part episode covering the top 10 films of 1962, and we've also got a jam-packed evening report set for release on January 24th. So take care, and I'll see you soon.